Today we're talking about 4 Hollywood stars who used to be absolutely everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, red carpets, all of it. And then, one by one, they almost completely disappeared. We're getting into what actually happened to each of them. Let's get into it. Before the tabloids turned her entire adult life into a running headline, Lindsay Lohan was one of the most promising young actors working in Hollywood. Full stop. And she didn't just become famous, she became famous absurdly young, which is really the first thing you have to understand about her story. Lohan started as a child model and actor, and by the time she landed The Parent Trap in 1998, people in the industry had already noticed something about her that's genuinely rare. She could carry a movie. That sounds like a small thing to say, but it isn't. Plenty of child actors get famous because they're cute or funny or memorable in a single scene. Lohan was doing something different. She had real screen presence, the kind that usually takes actors years to develop, and she had it playing 2 entirely separate characters in the same film. Then came Freaky Friday, then Mean Girls, and that one changed everything. Mean Girls wasn't just a hit, it became one of those rare movies that turns into a permanent piece of pop culture, still quoted constantly 2 decades later. And almost overnight, Lindsay Lohan wasn't just a working child actor anymore. She was one of the defining faces of an entire generation of teenagers. She was young, sharp, funny, clearly talented, and already carrying the kind of name recognition most actors never get in a full career. Hollywood thought it had found its next great star. And then, slowly, and then all at once, the exact machine that built her fame started eating her alive. Her personal life became public property in a way that's honestly hard to explain to anyone who didn't live through the mid-2000s. Paparazzi followed young female celebrities constantly during that era. Tabloids could turn an ordinary bad night into a front-page story, and new celebrity gossip sites meant rumors could spread within hours instead of waiting for a print deadline. Lohan became one of the biggest targets of that entire ecosystem. Her partying made news. Her relationships made news. Every legal issue, every stumble, every photo of her looking tired outside a club, all of it became content. And somewhere in there, the conversation stopped being about her acting altogether. That's really the moment that defines a downfall like this. It isn't necessarily when someone stops working, it's when the public stops asking what movie they're in and starts asking what happened to them instead. By the early 2000s, the actress who'd once looked like one of the safest bets in the entire industry had mostly disappeared from mainstream film. But here's where her story gets more interesting than a simple cautionary tale, because forgotten turns out to be the wrong word for what actually happened. She didn't vanish. She stepped back on her own terms, at her own pace. In 2014, she took a stage role in London's West End, in Speed the Plough, even as her film career had clearly stalled out. Not long after, she relocated to Dubai and started building a much quieter life, deliberately outside the Hollywood ecosystem that had consumed most of her 20s. And then, slowly, she started coming back. Netflix's Falling for Christmas in 2022 introduced audiences to a version of Lindsay Lohan a lot of people hadn't seen before. Older, noticeably more private, and visibly more comfortable in her own skin than the version tabloids had spent a decade chasing. She followed it with Irish Wish and Our Little Secret, steadily rebuilding trust with both studios and audiences. Then came the moment that would have seemed almost impossible during the worst years of her career. She returned to the role that shaped her childhood. Freaky Friday reunited her with Jamie Lee Curtis, and for Lohan, this wasn't just another credit on a resume. It was proof that an industry that had quietly written her off was willing to welcome her back. By 2025, major outlets were openly using the word comeback without irony. Lohan herself has said that stepping away from the industry for a while helped her fall back in love with acting in the first place. And that's really the point of her whole story. It isn't a tale about a celebrity fading into irrelevance. It's about what happens when someone gets famous far too fast, gets swallowed by that fame, disappears from the spotlight on purpose, and then eventually gets a real shot at coming back, this time on her own terms instead of the industry's. From The Parent Trap to Mean Girls, to a decade of tabloid obsession, to self-imposed exile, to something that genuinely looks like a second act. Her career proves that in Hollywood, disappearing doesn't always mean you're finished. Sometimes, it just means you're waiting for the industry to finally look at you differently. There was a stretch where Megan Fox looked almost destined to become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. Her breakthrough came with Transformers in 2007, and that movie wasn't just a hit, it was enormous, a genuine cultural event. Fox became one of the most recognizable young actresses on Earth practically overnight. Hollywood thought it had found its next big thing. She had the looks, she had the charisma, she had a franchise behind her, and suddenly, her name was everywhere you looked. But Fox's story doesn't follow the same shape as Lindsay Lohan's. She didn't just fade out. Her career got tangled up in a very specific and, honestly, kind of predictable way that Hollywood tends to treat actresses who become famous primarily for how they look. She was marketed hard as a sex symbol almost from the jump. The magazine covers came fast. The interviews leaned heavily into her image rather than her craft. And the public conversation around her started centering more on her persona than on her acting, which is a trap that swallowed a lot of talented actresses before her. Then came Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen, another commercial monster. But behind the scenes, Fox's relationship with director Michael Bay turned into a real point of controversy, after some pointed comments she made about him and the production drew massive media attention. Eventually, she didn't return for the third Transformers film at all. That single decision ended up being one of the defining turns of her whole career. One of the most recognizable young stars in the world had just written herself out of the exact franchise that made her famous. And the industry, as it tends to do, moved on fast. Fox went on to Jennifer's Body, a movie that underperformed at the box office when it came out, but has since developed a genuinely passionate cult following, the kind of reappraisal that happens years after the fact. She kept working. She showed up in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films, took on projects with directors outside the biggest studio machines, picked up supporting roles here and there, but the trajectory people expected for her, the one where she becomes the era's dominant blockbuster leading lady, just never fully materialized. Here's the twist in her story though. Fox never actually disappeared. Her celebrity status stayed massive the entire time. Whenever she showed up publicly, people paid attention. Whenever her look changed or her relationship status shifted, or she posted something new online, the internet reacted immediately. In other words, her fame consistently outpaced her film career, which is a genuinely interesting distinction once you sit with it. Hollywood had quietly stopped handing her the kind of roles that make someone an A-list movie star in the traditional sense, but the public never stopped paying attention to her. Her name kept generating headlines well into the 2020s, especially once her relationship with musician Machine Gun Kelly took off. Their engagement, the breakup rumors, the reconciliation stories, the eventual split, all of it kept Fox firmly planted in the celebrity news cycle, regardless of what she was or wasn't filming. In 2025, she and Kelly welcomed a daughter together, adding yet another chapter to an already very public relationship. By 2026, Fox was still pulling enormous attention through social media and entertainment coverage, arguably more consistently than most working actresses her age. So, did Megan Fox actually fall from A-list to forgotten? Not really, no. What happened is stranger than that. She went from being a Hollywood movie star in the traditional sense to being a global celebrity whose cultural visibility regularly outpaces her actual film visibility. That's a fundamentally different kind of career than the one she seemed set up for back in 2007. And it says something bigger about how fame itself has changed. In the 2000s, being A-list meant headlining major studio films. Full stop. Today, a celebrity can stay enormously culturally relevant without appearing in a single blockbuster in a given year. Megan Fox didn't vanish. The Hollywood leading lady version of her simply became much smaller than the version of her that exists in the public imagination. And maybe that's exactly why her career is still worth talking about. Because the real question isn't where did Megan Fox go, it's why did Hollywood stop building movies around someone it once treated as one of its biggest young stars? And that question still doesn't have a clean answer. Katherine Heigl's story might be the cleanest example on this entire list of how fast Hollywood's opinion of someone can flip. At her peak, she was everywhere. She was Dr. Izzy Stevens on Grey's Anatomy, and that wasn't just a decent television gig. That show was one of the biggest hits of its entire era, appointment viewing for millions of people every single week. Her performance on it earned her a Primetime Emmy in 2007, and from there, her film career took off just as fast. Knocked Up, 27 Dresses, The Ugly Truth, Life as We Know It. For a few years, she genuinely looked like Hollywood's next great romantic comedy lead. By the late 2000s, she'd pulled off something that's incredibly rare. Real television credibility stacked on top of real movie star recognition at the same time. And then her reputation started to shift. And it happened fast enough that you can point to specific moments where it turned. One of the biggest came in 2008, when Heigl pulled her own name from Emmy consideration, saying publicly that she hadn't been given material on Grey's Anatomy that season that she felt warranted a nomination. That comment generated an enormous amount of media attention, and not the kind that helps you. Then in 2010, she left the show entirely. Just like that, the actress who'd seemed to be sitting on top of the industry was no longer part of one of the biggest series on television. Her film career kept going, but something in the industry's perception of her had shifted for good. She started getting quietly labeled as difficult to work with. And whether or not every piece of that reputation was fair is a separate question from whether it mattered, because in entertainment, perception is basically the whole game. Studios aren't only hiring based on raw talent. They're weighing whether someone is commercially reliable, whether they're easy to work with day to day, whether the press around them tends to be positive, whether audiences actually like them as people. And once a negative reputation like that takes hold, it's brutally hard to walk back. Heigl has spoken since then about that period and acknowledged she made real mistakes along the way. But by then, the damage to her movie star trajectory was already visible in the numbers. The steady stream of romantic comedies that once looked like a guaranteed career lane started drying up, and eventually she pivoted back toward television, which turned out to be a genuinely important second chapter for her, rather than a step down. She landed roles in shows like Suits and other TV projects, doing consistently strong work, just no longer positioned as the industry's next Julia Roberts. By 2026, Heigl's story has taken on another layer, because she's spoken candidly about deliberately stepping back from the Hollywood grind to prioritize her family and a life outside Los Angeles. And her whole arc is a useful reminder of something audiences tend to forget. A celebrity's fall from grace usually isn't one single catastrophic event. More often, it's a chain reaction. A comment here, a reputation that calcifies, a high-profile exit, a couple of projects that underperform, a shift in what audiences want at that particular moment, and suddenly, the phone just stops ringing as often as it used to. Heigl never stopped being talented, she never stopped acting, and she never disappeared completely. But the version of Katherine Heigl who once looked destined to dominate studio comedies got quietly replaced by something a lot quieter, and, by her own account, a lot more sustainable. And that's exactly why she belongs on this list. She went from being one of the most recognizable faces in both television and romantic comedy to a performer with a much lower public profile. Not because her ability disappeared, but because Hollywood's relationship with her fundamentally changed. For a few years there, Taylor Lautner was one of the most famous young actors on the entire planet. And nearly all of that fame traced back to one single character, Jacob Black. When Twilight exploded into the global phenomenon it became, Lautner's entire life changed overnight. Teenagers everywhere knew his face on sight. Magazines wanted him on every cover. Studios wanted a piece of whatever this was. And Hollywood executives, doing exactly what Hollywood executives do, immediately saw an opportunity sitting right in front of them. Here was a young actor with a massive, ready-made fan base already built in. The obvious next move, at least on paper, was to turn him into a full-blown action star. Lautner took the swing. He headlined Abduction in 2011, and on paper, the logic tracked completely. Young star, action vehicle, a huge Twilight audience theoretically ready to follow him anywhere, and the potential for an entirely new franchise waiting on the other side of a hit. The movie did not perform the way anyone in that boardroom had hoped, and critics were not kind to it either. And that created a real problem, because Lautner had become famous specifically as part of Twilight. The character, the franchise, the whole cultural moment attached to it. What Hollywood actually needed to find out was whether audiences would show up for Taylor Lautner on his own, with none of that machinery around him. The answer, it turned out, wasn't strong enough to build a movie star career on. Other projects came after that, but the explosion everyone expected never happened. And what's strange about Lautner's specific case is that his fame didn't fade out gradually, the way Lohan's or Heigl's did. It seemed to collapse almost overnight. One moment, he was one of the biggest young stars on Earth. Then, fairly suddenly, he just wasn't everywhere anymore. There was no massive scandal attached to it, no public implosion, no headline announcing some dramatic end. The machine simply stopped generating the same level of momentum around him. And that's honestly one of the more brutal realities of how Hollywood works. Sometimes, nobody actively decides to end your career. The industry just quietly stops investing in you, and you're left to figure out what comes next on your own. Lautner eventually stepped back from chasing the level of fame he'd had during the Twilight years. In recent interviews, he's talked openly about the psychological toll of sudden, overwhelming fame and how difficult it was being recognized everywhere he went at that age. He also launched a podcast called The Squeeze, alongside his wife, Tay Lautner. Instead of trying to manufacture a return to 2010, he built a completely different kind of public life on his own terms. That distinction really matters here. The popular version of this story is that Taylor Lautner failed somehow. But that's not actually what happened. He became one of the most famous young actors alive. Hollywood then tried to convert that fame into something bigger, a standalone action franchise built around him personally, and that specific experiment just didn't take. Audiences remembered Jacob Black vividly. They just didn't automatically follow Taylor Lautner into whatever came next. And that's really the line between character fame and genuine star power. When the character fades, sometimes the fame fades right along with it, no matter how enormous it was in the moment. Taylor Lautner's career is one of the cleanest examples of that phenomenon you'll find anywhere in modern Hollywood. Proof that being attached to the biggest franchise in the world doesn't automatically translate into being a bankable name on your own. So, out of these four, who actually surprised you the most? Lindsay Lohan clawing her way all the way back on her own terms? Megan Fox staying enormous as a celebrity even while her film career cooled off? Katherine Heigl watching a single reputation shift reroute her entire career? Or Taylor Lautner going from the biggest young star on the planet to nearly invisible almost overnight? Part 2 is coming with 4 more stories, including one actor who didn't lose Hollywood to any scandal at all. He chose to leave it himself. And that decision is exactly what makes his comeback so interesting. Let me know in the comments which of these 4 hit you the hardest, and subscribe to PopSip so you don't miss part 2. I'll see you in the next video!